This is a story that changes everything. A disabled black girl is attacked by two racist cops, but just when they think they've won, her father, a lieutenant colonel in the army, steps in. And the game changes in an instant. Before we dive in, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Stay tuned, you won't believe what happens next. The day had started like any other for 14-year-old Maya Johnson. A shy, intelligent girl. Maya had always loved the small, familiar things about her life. She loved the smell of fresh books from the library, the cool breeze that swept through her window every afternoon, and her dad's warm hugs when he came home from his military duties. But there was one thing that always made Maya feel different: her wheelchair. Born with cerebral palsy, Maya had learned how to navigate the world on her own terms. Though life was often more difficult for her than most kids, she had an unshakable optimism and a passion for art. Despite her disability, Maya dreamed of becoming an artist, drawing worlds that others couldn't see. On this particular day, she had just finished visiting the local library with her mother, Tanya, and was heading home along a quiet street in their predominantly white neighborhood. The sun was low, casting a warm golden glow, and the two of them were laughing as they made their way toward their apartment. But as they rounded the corner, everything shifted. A patrol car pulled up abruptly, its tires screeching against the pavement. Maya's mother, Tanya, instinctively held her daughter's wheelchair back, sensing something wasn't right. It was the tone of the officer's voice when he shouted at them that stopped them in their tracks. "Hey, stop right there!" Officer Jensen, a tall, broad-shouldered man, yelled from the driver's seat. Maya's mother stiffened. "Is there a problem, officer?" Tanya asked, her voice steady but with a note of suspicion. Maya's heart beat faster, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. Officer Jensen stepped out of the car, a dark look on his face. Behind him, Officer Davis, his partner, followed. Davis was thinner, with a sharp jawline, and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face. "Where are you two headed?" Jensen asked, his gaze fixed on Maya, who had stopped moving. She could feel his eyes on her, sizing her up, and it sent a chill down her spine. Tanya frowned. "We're just going home, officer. Why are you asking?" Jensen took a few steps closer, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen you two around here before. I'm wondering what a young black girl in a wheelchair is doing so far from home." Maya's stomach dropped. She could hear the subtle undertones of racial profiling in his words, and it made her feel small, like she didn't belong here. "Maya has cerebral palsy," Tanya replied, her voice slightly shaky now. "She's just going to her house. What's the issue?" Officer Davis stepped forward, his eyes flicking to Maya's wheelchair with disdain. "The issue is you're both out here alone, in an area where people don't usually see your kind." He sneered, as if their mere presence offended him. Maya, barely able to control her emotions, looked down at her lap. "Why did it always have to be like this?" "I think you need to come with us," Jensen said suddenly. He started walking toward Maya, his hand hovering near his taser. Tanya instinctively moved in front of her daughter, holding her hands up. "Excuse me?" Tanya's voice was sharp now. "We haven't done anything wrong. You have no right to stop us. We're citizens of this city, and we're just going home." But Jensen wasn't listening. Without warning, he grabbed Maya's wheelchair by the handles, jerking it backward, causing her to flinch. Her breath hitched. Tanya gasped. "Mom, please," Maya whispered, the fear rising in her chest. "Maya!" Tanya screamed, but before she could step forward, Officer Davis rushed up behind her. He shoved her away, sending her stumbling back onto the sidewalk. "Stay back," Davis barked. Maya's heart pounded as she struggled to hold herself together. The world felt like it was closing in. The officers were too close, too aggressive. "Let go of my chair," Maya cried out, her voice trembling. But Jensen wasn't listening. He was too busy trying to force Maya's chair toward his car. His grip was firm, pulling harder than he needed to. Maya felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wasn't going to let them see her cry. Suddenly, the door to the black SUV parked down the street opened. A man stepped out, his posture rigid, his uniform crisp. His Army Lieutenant Colonel insignia gleamed in the sunlight. "That's enough," the man shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. Both officers froze. Their eyes widened when they saw who had just arrived. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, walked toward them with purpose. The military presence was undeniable. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, a respected officer in the U.S. Army, and Maya's father. Colonel Harrison, Officer Jensen said, his voice wavering slightly. He had recognized the rank, but clearly didn't expect to see such a high-ranking military officer in the middle of this altercation. "Step away from my daughter," Colonel Harrison commanded, his voice low but powerful. Now, Jensen didn't know how to react. He hesitated, then took a step back, looking to his partner for guidance. Tanya stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening. She had known James Harrison had risen in the ranks. She had known he was respected by everyone in his unit. But to see him stand there in full uniform, demanding respect, was something she hadn't expected. "Sir, we were just trying to," Jensen began, but Colonel Harrison cut him off. "No, you weren't. You're harassing a disabled black girl in front of her mother, and you have no reason to be doing so. You will immediately let go of her wheelchair and leave. Now." Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at her father. This was the man who had always been there for her, who had stood up for people in situations far worse than this, but now she realized he was fighting for her. Colonel Harrison's eyes flicked to Officer Davis, who had been silent up until now. "You too," he said coldly. "Move." Now, the two officers stood frozen, not knowing how to react. They had just realized who they had been messing with. The girl they had harassed, the disabled girl in the wheelchair, wasn't just anyone. Her father wasn't just a soldier, he was a lieutenant colonel, and that changed everything. The tension was thick as Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison stood over the two officers, his stance unyielding. The weight of his military rank seemed to settle over the scene like a storm cloud. Officer Jensen and Officer Davis looked at one another, both realizing the gravity of the situation. They had crossed a line they hadn't anticipated. And now, facing a military officer of high rank, they were in over their heads. "I said step away from her," Colonel Harrison repeated, his voice deep and commanding. His eyes bore into Jensen, then shifted to Davis, both of whom hesitated before taking a slow step back. They knew they were caught in their wrongdoing, and that knowledge stung worse than any reprimand. The K-9, still growling at its handlers, seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. Its aggression had ceased, replaced by confusion and unease. Maya, still in her wheelchair, sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly. Her mother, Tanya, stood beside her, equally speechless. It wasn't just the police officers' hostility that had unsettled them. It was the sudden realization that their lives were under threat, and they had no control over the situation. Until now. "Colonel Harrison," Jensen stammered, "we were just doing our job. We received a report, and I don't care about your reports." Colonel Harrison cut him off. "You've targeted an innocent person based on nothing but assumptions and racism. You think your badge and gun give you the right to treat my daughter this way?" Officer Davis swallowed hard. His face turned red as his mind raced for any justification. "We thought she was acting suspicious, sir. We were just trying to ask a few questions, but it got out of hand. You don't get to decide who's suspicious based on the color of their skin." Colonel Harrison's voice was louder now, more forceful. The other officers, who had begun to gather at the edge of the scene, stood frozen, watching the confrontation unfold. The power dynamics had shifted. What had started as a random traffic stop had now turned into an explosive public humiliation for the two officers. Tanya, who had been silently watching the exchange, stepped forward cautiously. "James," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of concern and pride, "we should just go home now. This is too much." But Colonel Harrison didn't take his eyes off the officers. "No, Tanya, not this time, not anymore." Officer Jensen and Davis took a collective step back, clearly out of their depth. Their eyes darted toward the K-9, still standing alert, but now completely still, almost as if it was waiting for its next command. The officers had never considered the consequences of their actions before now, and the weight of the situation was sinking. "I'm taking my daughter home," Colonel Harrison finally said, his voice controlled but firm. "And you're going to remember this moment. You've messed with the wrong family. Do your job and leave us alone." The officers nodded, though neither one dared to make eye contact with Colonel Harrison again. Without another word, they turned and walked back to their squad car, the K-9 reluctantly following. Maya could feel the lingering presence of the officers even as they drove away, but as soon as the car doors slammed shut, A weight lifted from her shoulders. Her father had stood up for them in a way that made everything feel different. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small or insignificant. She felt protected. Later that evening, Johnson residence, 7 hours. The day's events had left her rattled, but the presence of her father at her side had calmed her nerves. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, how 2 racist cops had tried to intimidate them, but how her father's power had turned everything around. Tanya entered the room, her expression thoughtful but warm. "You okay, sweetie?" Maya nodded slowly, her pencil still in her hand. "Yeah, I'm just trying to process everything that happened." Tanya sat down beside her daughter. "It's not easy, I know. You know how the world works and how people see us. But today we saw something powerful." Maya raised an eyebrow, turning toward her mother. "What do you mean?" Tanya smiled softly. "I mean your father. He's not just a man in uniform. He's a force of nature when it comes to protecting those he loves. Today he showed you what true power is." Maya nodded, her hand resting on her notebook. "I know. I felt it when he stepped in. It was like the whole world stopped." Tanya gently rubbed her daughter's shoulder. "You'll never be alone, Miki. We'll always stand up for what's right. And your father, he'll move mountains for you just like he always has." Back at the police headquarters, Officer Jensen and Officer Davis were both sitting in a small room, nervously awaiting their next orders. They had been called in for an official debriefing regarding the incident with Maya Johnson, but neither of them knew what to expect. The door to the room opened suddenly, and Captain Richards, a no-nonsense officer with years of experience, stepped inside. His gaze swept over them with cold indifference. "You two have a lot to explain," Captain Richards said, his voice low and threatening. He pulled up a chair and sat down in front of them. "I just spoke to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. You messed up big time." Jensen swallowed nervously. "Captain, we didn't know." "Don't give me that," Richards cut in. "You harassed a young girl in a wheelchair. You pulled your dog on her. You didn't follow procedure. And now, because of your stupidity, the whole department is under a microscope. Do you know how much damage you've done?" Davis shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. We didn't mean to escalate it." Captain Richards slammed his fist on the table. "You never meant to escalate it. But now we have to clean up this mess. You've made this about race, and now it's about more than just your careers. You've brought the army into this. Do you understand what that means?" The weight of those words hit them both hard. Inside the dimly lit room, Captain Richards stood over Officer Jensen and Officer Davis, his face hard and unforgiving. The tension in the room was suffocating. Both officers were shaking with fear, their earlier bravado now long gone. The full weight of their actions was starting to settle in. They had underestimated not just a young disabled girl, but the power that came with her father's military rank. "You've made a mess of everything," Richards repeated, his voice a low growl. "A lieutenant colonel has the ear of the governor, and that's not even mentioning his contacts within the Department of Defense. You've just dragged this entire department into a public scandal." Jensen looked at Davis, who was avoiding his gaze, both officers struggling to grasp the gravity of the situation. They had never thought their routine traffic stop would snowball into this. "We were just doing our jobs, sir." Jensen stammered, trying to explain. "We didn't know who she was. We didn't know." "That's the point, Jensen. You didn't know." Richards cut him off, pacing the small room. "You had no idea who you were dealing with. And now you're going to answer for it. I'm pulling you both from active duty until we can figure out how to clean up your mess. You'll stay here and you'll be questioned. Your careers, they're hanging by a thread." Officer Davis's face was pale, his voice barely a whisper. "We didn't think it would escalate like this." "That's the problem," Richards snapped, turning to face both officers. "You didn't think, you acted on assumptions, prejudices. You let that drive you, and now we have a national crisis on our hands." He paused, the silence hanging heavy in the air. "You've made enemies out of people with far more power than you could ever imagine. And when the media gets wind of this, it's going to be war." Maya sat on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, staring out the window. Her thoughts were racing. What had happened earlier that afternoon was more than just an encounter with 2 racist cops. It was a wake-up call. Her father's military presence had turned the situation around, but there was still a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She had always known that being a black woman, especially a disabled black woman, meant that she had to be more careful, more aware, but she had never experienced something like this before. It was as if, for the first time, She had seen the ugliness of the world up close. "Maya, honey, come here," Tanya called softly from the kitchen. Maya turned and wheeled herself over to the small kitchen table. Her mother was sitting there, hands clasped in front of her face troubled but calm. Tanya had always been a source of strength for Maya, but tonight her mother's eyes were filled with concern. "Mom, I don't understand," Maya said, her voice quiet. "Why did they target me? I didn't do anything wrong. They just attacked us. Just like that." Tanya reached across the table and took Maya's hand, her fingers warm and reassuring. "Maya, there are things in this world that we can't control. There are people who will judge us, no matter what we do, no matter who we are, but what I want you to understand is that we will never be silent. Your father has always been there for us, and he's going to make sure this never happens again." Maya looked at her mother, the fierce protective love in her eyes. "But why does it always happen? Why do they see us like this?" Tanya took a deep breath, the weight of those questions heavy on her heart. "Because, sweetheart, there are people in this world who can't see past their own hatred. But your father," she paused, glancing toward the living room where Colonel Harrison had been watching the news. "He has connections. He's fought in places most people would never dare to go, and when he steps in, people listen." Maya nodded, though a part of her still felt like she was in the eye of the storm, waiting for everything to unravel. She glanced over at her father, sitting in the living room, speaking quietly on the phone with some. Her dad had always been her hero, but today, he felt more like a force of nature. He had just saved them, but the fight wasn't over. Outside the police station, 10:30 p.m. The scene outside the police station was chaotic. Protesters had gathered, their chants echoing down the street. Their signs read "Justice for Maya" and "Stop the Racism." The protesters were united, standing up not just for Maya, but for everyone who had been a victim of systemic injustice. As the protest grew larger, the tension between the local authorities and the people began to escalate. The police barricades had been set up, and the officers were prepared for confrontation. But as the night wore on, a new presence began to loom large over the crowd. Colonel Harrison was on the move again. With his military team standing by, Colonel Harrison addressed the crowd with the same calm authority that had diffused the situation earlier. He was no longer just a father, he was a man of authority, a protector, and a leader. He didn't want violence. He didn't want this to turn into a full-scale riot, but he wasn't about to let what had happened to his daughter slide without consequences. "I understand your anger," Colonel Harrison said into the microphone, his voice booming across the street. "But let's be clear about one thing, we are not backing down from this. My daughter was attacked for no reason other than the color of her skin, and I will make sure that the people responsible face justice." The crowd fell silent, then erupted into a wave of applause and cheer. The weight of his words, the force behind his authority, made them feel like they were finally being heard. Police station, 11:00 p.m. Back inside the station, the officers involved in the incident with Maya were beginning to feel the pressure. They had seen the protest grow. They had heard the chants. They knew their actions were being scrutinized on every channel, and the media was quick to label them as the culprits in a racially charged incident. But what they didn't know was that they were just a small part of a much bigger investigation, one that was being led by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the Department of Justice. The officers were now trapped in a web of their own making. The public outcry was just the beginning, and soon they would find themselves under the microscope. Their careers were on the line, but the damage had already been done. The world was watching, and nothing could erase what had happened. The night was growing colder, and the streets were filled with the restless energy of the protesters. The crowd had grown exponentially in the last hour. News crews were now on site, broadcasting live, and the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that the Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's speech had shifted the momentum in their favor. But this wasn't just about speaking out anymore, it was about action. Maya, still reeling from the events of the day, sat in her room, her eyes glued to the television. She could hear the murmurs of the protesters growing louder outside the apartment window. The whole city was buzzing with outrage. It wasn't just about one police officer or one racist incident anymore. It was about a system that had failed people like her for far too long. She couldn't help but feel both proud and fearful. Her father was doing everything he could to expose the truth, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. People who held power didn't give it up without a fight. Shreveport Police Headquarters. Inside the police station, the mood was tense. Officers had been scrambling to secure their statements, and try to piece together a defense for their actions. The internal investigation was underway, but everyone knew that the scandal had already gotten too big to ignore. Officer Benson and Officer Davis sat across from Captain Richards, their faces pale and eyes tired. Their once firm posture had now collapsed. The weight of the situation hung heavy on them. They had been caught, and there was no getting out of this mess. "I still don't understand," Benson muttered, rubbing his forehead. "It was just a routine stop. We didn't expect this to blow up." "You never expected to target the wrong person," Captain Richards snapped. "That's your biggest mistake. You went after a disabled black girl. You didn't think, and now we're in this nightmare." Davis looked around the room nervously. "But the colonel, he just showed up, out of nowhere. We didn't even know who she was until after." Richards shot a sharp look at him. "You never should have laid a hand on her regardless of who her father is. This goes beyond your incompetence. The world is watching us now." The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens and the murmur of protesters chanting outside. The walls were closing in. News outlets broadcast live footage of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison as he walked the streets, speaking with local leaders, assuring them that the Army and Justice Department were actively involved in the investigation. The anger in the crowd was palpable, but it was now directed at systemic injustice, not just a single officer. "We won't back down until justice is served," Elijah, one of the local activists, shouted into a megaphone. The crowd responded with a unified chant, "Justice for Maya." In the midst of all this, Colonel Harrison stood tall, his face calm but determined. He knew this wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was bigger than Maya. This was about police accountability, racial profiling, and ensuring that the scales of justice were balanced for everyone, regardless of race or ability. His eyes were sharp as he scanned the crowd. He knew the streets were full of people who had faced the same kind of discrimination, the same kind of abuse, and he couldn't let it slide any longer. He turned to General Williams, his old military comrade, who had joined him on the ground to offer support. "We need to find out who's behind this. This isn't just a case of rogue officers. There's a network, and it goes deep. I need everything we've got." General Williams nodded. "We've already started pulling the thread. We're looking into the connections between local law enforcement and the military contractors. They've been operating for years. It's time we bring it all to light." Maya's apartment, 1:30 a.m. Back in the apartment, Maya sat quietly, her head resting on her. The weight of the evening hung heavily over her. Her thoughts raced. The events had been overwhelming, and as much as she wanted to believe that the world was finally waking up, there was a part of her that feared it would all be in vain. Her father had stood up for her today, but the fight was just beginning, and Maya knew this wasn't just about her anymore. The pain, the racism, the systemic inequality, it was something that had plagued her entire community for generations. She glanced at the TV. The protesters were still gathered, their chants reverberating through the streets, but this time, there was something different about it. There was a shift happening. The conversation was changing, but that didn't mean it would be easy. Her father's actions, while powerful, had made him a target. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was standing up to a system that didn't want to be challenged. And in a system like this, the consequences were never clear. Reports were flying in from all sides, and the pressure was mounting. The internal investigation had reached the highest levels of the department, but it was clear that the leadership was scrambling. Officers who had been involved in the incident were now on edge, awaiting their fate. Captain Richards stared out the window, watching the protesters rallying outside. He could feel the weight of what was coming. This was no longer a matter of protocol. It had become a political fight, and everyone involved knew that the fallout would be massive. But what no one expected was the ripple effect that Colonel Harrison's intervention would have. The Army was now involved, and that meant that everything was about to shift, from the streets of Shreveport to the top levels of government. As Officer Jensen sat in his chair, his head hung low in defeat, he wondered, how did it all go so wrong? The hours that followed were a blur of chaos and confusion. The city had transformed into a battleground of ideals, with protesters flooding the streets, demanding justice for Maya. The news had spread like wildfire, and the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. Inside the police station, Captain Richards stood at the center of the storm. His office was now a war room, a place of urgent phone calls, strategy sessions, and whispered conversation. His officers were still rattled by the confrontation with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, But that was only the beginning. The higher-ups had already contacted him, and the pressure was mounting. Public opinion was turning against the department, and there were whispers of federal involvement. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. The media was already portraying the Shreveport Police Department as a symbol of systemic racism, and the damage to the department's credibility was already irreversible. Richard's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Come in," he barked. A young officer stepped inside, looking uneasy. "Sir, we've just received a federal order. We're to stand down immediately. The investigation is being taken over by the Department of Justice." Richard's face paled. This was worse than he thought. The feds didn't just step in for small cases. This was going to explode. "Get the files ready," Richards ordered. "We need to be transparent about everything. The last thing we need is more bad press." The events of the day, the harassment, the brutality, the sudden involvement of her father, had left her feeling like she was on the edge of something monumental. Sitting by her window, she could hear the rumbles of the protests outside growing louder with each passing hour. The protests were no longer just about her. It was about something much bigger. The voices of the oppressed were rising, demanding change, and it wasn't just the people on the streets. Her father was leading the charge, but this wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of the entire community. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called out. Tanya entered, a calm but concerned expression on her face. "Maya, sweetie, we need to talk." Maya looked up, her face softening. "What's going on, Mom?" Tanya sat down beside her daughter, her hand resting gently on Maya's. "Your father just got off the phone with the Department of Justice. They're taking over the investigation. It's not just the police now. This is national." Maya nodded, her heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and fear. "Dad's making a difference, isn't he?" Tanya smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "Yes, sweetie. But we both know that the system doesn't give up easily. Your dad's fighting against a whole network of corruption, and the people he's up against, they won't stop just because they're exposed." Maya took a deep breath, the weight of her mother's words settling over her. This was far from over. The fight had just begun, and her father's battle for justice was only a small part of it. But Maya knew one thing for sure. Her father wasn't backing down, and neither would she. The atmosphere in the station was tense, and for the first time in a long while there was a sense of unease that no one could shake. Officers were scrambling, trying to make sense of the situation, but it was quickly becoming apparent that their department was under fire. The public's trust had been shattered, and the media was making sure everyone knew about it. At the center of the turmoil was Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. His name was everywhere, in news reports, on social media, even on the lips of protesters. The military's involvement had shifted the power of the situation. No one in the police department had anticipated that a single man, a father, could have such an impact. Colonel Harrison had never asked for the spotlight. He hadn't wanted to be the face of a movement, but what he had done was simple. He had stood up for his daughter, and in doing so, he had struck at the heart of a system that had been broken for too long. The streets were finally quieting down, the protests beginning to wind down for the night, but the energy remained. Maya could feel it. It wasn't just the anger of those demanding justice. It was the energy of a community awakening to the reality of the systemic issues that had held them back for so long. As the sun began to rise, Colonel Harrison stood by his car, his eyes scanning the horizon. The moment he had feared was upon them. The Department of Justice had officially taken over the investigation, and the weight of the situation was now out of his hands. But there was still work to be done. He turned to his daughter, who had wheeled herself up beside him. "You did good today, Maya," he said, his voice soft but proud. "You stood your ground. You made them see you." Maya looked up at her father, her eyes filled with admiration. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You showed me what real courage looks like." He smiled, ruffling her hair. "It's not just about courage, Maya. It's about fighting for what's right, no matter how difficult it is." Maya nodded, knowing that her father's fight wasn't over. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but with him by her side, she felt like she could face anything. The world had just begun to change, and it was only the beginning.